Liberation theology was the unforeseen enfant terrible in the academic and ecclesial realms of theological production during the last decades of the 20th century. It brought to the conversation not only a new theme, liberation, but also a new perspective on doing theology and a novel way of referring to God's being and action in history. Its project to reconfigure the interplay between religious studies, history, and politics became a meaningful topic of analysis and dialogue in the general theological discourse. Many scholars perceive in its emergence a drastic epistemological rupture, a radical change in paradigm, and a significant shift in both the ecclesial and social role of theology. Its origins are diverse and not exclusive to theological and ecclesiastical horizons. One important source, neglected by some accounts, was the complex constellation of liberation struggles during the 1960s and early 1970s. It was a time of social turmoil when many things seemed out of joint. Those include a strong anti-war movement protest, a spread of decolonization movements all over the Third World, the feminist struggle against patriarchy and sexism, a robust challenge to racial bigotry, the Stonewall Rebellion against homophobia and gay discrimination, student protests in Paris, Prague, Mexico, and New York in opposition to repressive states of all stripes, and guerrilla insurgencies and social unrest in many Latin American nations. Another significant factor regarding the intellectual origins of liberation theology was the development of a non-dogmatic Marxism that read Marx's text as an ethical critique on human oppression and as a projection of a utopian, non-oppressive future, something akin to a kingdom of freedom. This heterodox reading of Marx by authors like the German philosopher Ernst Bloch made possible something considered largely unthinkable until then, which is a constructive and affirmative dialogue between theology and Marxism, located at the margins of church and party hierarchies with their rigid orthodoxies. Other iconoclastic authors like Herbert Marcuse and Franz Fanon were passionately read from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Berkeley to Nairobi, with intellectual perspectives not limited exclusively to the academia. Exiled from Brazil, Paulo Freire delivered scathing critiques of traditional educational systems and promoted a pedagogy of the liberation of the oppressed. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ernesto Che Guevara became emblematic icons and martyrs of those turbulent times. Within the churches, important processes were also occurring. To the surprise of many, Pope John XXIII summoned the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II. Vatican II had three main objectives, according to Lewis. One, to change the attitude of the Roman Catholic Church towards the modern post-Enlightenment intellectual world, from censure and condemnation to openness and dialogue. Second, to heal the fragmentation of Christianity by positioning the Roman Catholic Church within the emerging ecumenical movement. Third, to face the plight of a world marked by suffering, violence, oppression, and injustice with honesty and compassion. Now, Latin American liberation theology. Vatican II was followed by regional synods of bishops. The most famous of them was the General Meeting of Latin American Roman Catholic bishops that took place from August 26 to September 6, 1968, in the Colombian city of Medellin. Vatican II opened the theological dialogue with modern rationality. Medellin was perceived as a prophetic convocation against poverty, inequality, and oppression. Certainly, the Medellin conference was a meeting of bishops, not of trained or professional theologians, but several Roman Catholic theologians were present and collaborated substantially in the drafting of the final documents. The general tone emerging from the conference allowed the possibility of rethinking the theological enterprise from the perspective of the liberation of the poor and the downtrodden. Prior to the Medellin meeting in July 1968, Gustavo Gutierrez gave a lecture in Chimbote, Peru, significantly titled Towards a Theology of Liberation, that established a close connection between spiritual redemption and human liberation. In 1971, the first edition of Gutierrez's book, Theology of Liberation, was published, a landmark in Latin American theological writing. Among the many texts that rocked the placid realm of theological production during those early years of Latin American liberation theology were Jose Miranda's Marx y la Biblia and Juan Luis II's Liberación de la Teología. What could be considered the main tenets of this Latin American theological movement? Luis would identify 5. 1, the retrieval of the subversive memories inscribed in sacred scriptures, which are hidden below layers of cultic regulations and doctrinal orthodoxies, but never totally effaced. 2, a historical understanding of Jesus' proclamation of God's kingdom. The kingdom is conceived as referring not to some otherworldly post-mortem realm, but rather to the unceasing hope of a social configuration characterized by justice, solidarity, and freedom. 3, the divine preferential option for the poor, the excluded, and the destitute of this world. 4, theology cannot be reduced to an intellectual understanding of the faith. It must also be a practical commitment for historical transformation. 5, God is conceived not as an immutable and impassible entelechy, but in line with the biblical narratives, as a compassionate internal spirit who hears and pays close attention to the cries of the oppressed, and whose action in human history has the redemption of the downtrodden and excluded as its ultimate telos. Now, there were ecclesiastical theological disputes. Many in the hierarchical church, including some members of the Roman Curia, viewed these potential disruptions of episcopal authority with marked distrust and moved to restrict the autonomy of some Latin American theologians. Rome was also concerned about the consequences of this new theological perspective for dogmatic orthodoxy. A long protracted confrontation emerged, one that still continues into the present. Political power matters. Since their colonial inception, an official linkage between the state and the Roman Catholic Church has characterized Latin American nations. It was sometimes the source of acute conflict whenever the ethical conscience of bishops, priests, missionaries, and theologians clashed with the severe exploitation of the native communities. Luis explains more, but I'll move to close this presentation. Black liberation theology. If it is wrong to locate the birth of liberation theology exclusively in Roman Catholic circles, it is also a mistake to situate it solely in Latin America. During the times of slavery and racial discrimination in the United States, Black churches were communities of solidarity and hope for enslaved peoples of African ancestry. The foremost thinker among African American liberation theologians at the beginning was the recently deceased James Cone. In his 1969 book, Black Theology and Black Power, Cone still tentatively wrote, "The work of Christ is essentially a liberating work directed toward and by the oppressed." I will stop there. and this paper by Luis Rivera-Pagan. Thank you.
And then the presentation on Luis was also interesting on how liberation theology came about. And I was thinking about the preferential option for the poor, which had to come about. But I'm also left wondering that if the theological enterprise is only something that is done by those in power, what does it mean? How useful is it? Is it not why it fizzles out? Because if those who have power are the ones who are planning how liberation should go, is it possible for it to continue, or is it easy for it to fizzle out? But again, maybe in linking with previous papers, I keep thinking that there's a need to keep it going, to keep it continuing, so that every time there's liberation, it needs to be looked at again, and the translation continues. Yeah, that's what I have to say, Jione.